There are nights in Las Vegas when the desert air carries something electric, something that has nothing to do with the neon lights blazing along the strip or the sound of slot machines spilling coins onto casino floors. There are nights when fate walks through a door wearing torn shoes and a borrowed coat and changes the course of everything. This is one of those nights. And if you think you know how this story ends, I promise you, you don't. It was the autumn of 1978. Las Vegas was at its most intoxicating. The hotels rose like gilded monuments against the black Nevada sky, and inside those glittering palaces, the world's most celebrated entertainers performed night after night to sold-out crowds hungry for glamour, for laughter, for the kind of magic that only certain people are born with. Dean Martin was one of those people. There was simply no one else quite like him. When he walked onto a stage, something shifted in the room. A warmth, a looseness, as if the entire audience collectively exhaled and decided that for the next 2 hours, nothing outside these walls would matter. He had that effect on people. He always had. That particular October night, Dean had finished another flawless performance at one of the Strip's most prestigious hotels. The crowd had given him a standing ovation that lasted nearly 4 minutes. He had smiled, bowed, waved, done all the things you do when thousands of strangers love you. And then he had walked off the stage and immediately become something quieter, something more private, because behind the easy grin and the effortless cool, Dean Martin carried a weight that very few people in that glittering audience would ever have guessed. A grief so old and so deep it had become part of him, like scar tissue over a wound that never fully healed. He made his way through the backstage corridors and out through a private exit, where a member of his team was waiting to escort him to the hotel's finest restaurant. This was his ritual after shows. A quiet table, a good meal, a glass of wine, 30 minutes of peace before the world found him again. The restaurant was called the Golden Room, and it earned its name. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across white linen tablecloths. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany. Somewhere near the back, a pianist played something soft and unhurried. The air smelled of roasted garlic, fresh bread, and expensive cologne. It was the kind of place where people came specifically to be seen and to see. Dean was seated immediately at his favorite corner table, slightly away from the main dining area, offering him a partial view of the room, without placing him directly in the center of it. The maitre d' greeted him by name. The sommelier appeared within seconds. Famous faces dotted the room. A film producer here, a television actress there, a senator whose name Dean recognized from the newspapers. Las Vegas in 1978 was that kind of place. Everyone who mattered seemed to pass through eventually. And tonight, someone else was about to walk through that door. Someone whose arrival would quietly rearrange everything Dean Martin thought he knew about his own life. He had just lifted his wine glass when the front doors of the Golden Room opened. At first, no one seemed to notice. The door swung in slowly, the way hesitant doors do, and for a moment the figure standing on the threshold seemed almost afraid to cross it. She was young, strikingly so, 22 years old, though she looked old in a way that hard living makes people look older. Her coat was a men's overcoat, several sizes too large, brown and fraying at the cuffs. Beneath it she wore a gray sweater with a small tear near the collar, and jeans that had seen far better days. Her shoes, once white sneakers, were held together at the left toe with a strip of electrical tape. She carried a single canvas bag on her shoulder, small and worn, the kind of bag that had been packed and repacked so many times the zipper barely caught anymore. Her name was Amy Carter, and she had not eaten a real meal in 72 hours. She stood at the entrance of the Golden Room, the way a person stands at the edge of something they know might go badly, with her chin slightly lowered, her shoulders pulled inward, her eyes moving quickly around the room in that practiced way that homeless people develop, scanning for threats, for exits, for the precise moment when someone's expression shifts from indifference to hostility. She had learned to read rooms like that. She had to. The streets had taught her that lesson with extraordinary efficiency. The maitre d' was moving toward her. She could see his face already tightening with professional displeasure. She knew that look. She had been on the receiving end of it dozens of times in the past year. But Amy Carter had made a decision somewhere out on the sidewalk tonight, standing in the warm light spilling through the restaurant's frosted windows, her stomach hollow and cramping, her legs exhausted from another day of walking. She had made a decision that tonight she would try. Just one more time, she would try. She crossed the room before the maitre d' could intercept her. She moved between the tables with her eyes fixed straight ahead, ignoring the turned heads and the sudden drop in nearby conversations. She could feel every gaze in the room tracking her. The pianist stumbled briefly on a chord. She kept walking, because Amy Carter, despite everything the world had taken from her, was not a coward. Whatever else had been stripped away, her apartment, her job, her documents, her safety, her dignity, they had not managed to take her courage. Not yet. She stopped beside Dean Martin's table. He looked up from his plate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Later, people who witnessed what happened next would describe it differently depending on who they were. Some remember the silence that fell over the restaurant as almost theatrical, like the hush before a conductor raises his baton. Others remember the expression on Dean Martin's face. Not shock exactly, but something more careful than that. A stillness, a quality of attention that seemed to belong to a different, older version of the famous entertainer. A version that existed beneath the stage persona in a quieter and more complicated place. Amy's voice, when she finally found it, was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I'm so sorry to bother you. I can see you're having dinner, and I know I have absolutely no right to ask this, but..." She stopped, swallowed. Her hands tightened on the strap of her canvas bag. "I haven't eaten in 3 days, and I was wondering, if you weren't going to finish everything on your plate, if maybe I could have whatever you left." The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture to it. A woman at a nearby table pressed her hand to her mouth. A man in a dinner jacket slowly set down his fork. The pianist had stopped playing entirely. Every single person in the Golden Room was holding their breath, watching the young homeless woman who had just asked Dean Martin for his leftovers, and waiting to see what the famous man with the easy smile and a glass of red wine would do next. What happened instead was this. Richard Wilson moved. Wilson was a restaurant manager, a compact, precise man in his mid-50s who wore his authority the way some men wear cologne, which is to say too heavily and in all the wrong situations. He materialized at Amy's side with remarkable speed, his face arranged into an expression of professional fury, and before anyone could react, he had closed his hand around Amy's upper arm. "You need to leave this establishment immediately," he said, pitching his voice low but not low enough. "This is a private dining room for paying guests. You are trespassing." He began steering her toward the door. Amy went without resistance. She had learned not to resist. Resisting only ever made it worse. And that was when Dean Martin stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture dramatically. He simply rose from his chair with the kind of unhurried authority that belongs to people who have never needed to perform dominance because they simply possess it. And he said 2 words. "Let go." Wilson stopped. Dean's eyes were fixed on the manager's hand, the hand still gripping Amy's arm. When he spoke again, his voice had not risen in volume, but it had changed in some other, more fundamental way. There was an edge beneath it now, quiet and absolute. "I said let her go, right now." Wilson released her. For a moment, the manager stood there working through his options, and then apparently decided he didn't have any, because he took a small, careful step backward and said nothing. Dean looked at Amy, really looked at her, the way people rarely look at someone living on the streets. Not through her, not past her, not at the inconvenient problem of her. At her eyes, which were dark and tired and still somehow, impossibly, full of something that hadn't quite been extinguished yet. At the way she held her jaw, slightly lifted. Even now, even after being grabbed in a room full of strangers, at something about her face that he couldn't name yet, but felt himself responding to in a way he didn't entirely understand. "Have you really not eaten in 3 days?" he asked. She nodded once. A single, controlled nod that cost her something. "Then you're not eating leftovers tonight." He turned to the nearest waiter, a young man standing frozen 3 feet away with a bread basket in his hands. "I'd like you to bring this young lady the best dinner your kitchen can prepare. Full course. Everything. Whatever she'd like." Wilson stepped forward. "Mr. Martin, I must respectfully point out that the other guests in this room have certain expectations of their dining experience and the presence of..." Dean turned to him with an expression of such calm, complete finality that the manager's sentence simply stopped working midway through. "If someone else's hunger can ruin the atmosphere in this room," Dean said quietly, "then the atmosphere in this room was never worth very much to begin with. Wouldn't you agree?" Nobody answered. Nobody moved. The room remained utterly, completely still. Then Dean pulled out the chair directly across from him at his table, and he looked at Amy Carter, and he said, very simply, "Please sit down. You're my guest tonight." Amy Carter sat down. She wasn't sure exactly why. Or rather, she knew why. Because she was exhausted and hungry and her feet hurt. And this man had just done something for her that no one had done in a very long time. But she wasn't sure she entirely trusted it yet. She perched on the edge of the chair the way a bird perches on a branch it isn't certain will hold its weight, her bag in her lap, her hands folded on top of it, watching Dean Martin with a mixture of gratitude and wariness that people who have been disappointed many times develop as a kind of armor. The kitchen, to its credit, did not make her wait long. Fresh bread arrived first, still warm, accompanied by butter and olive oil, then a bowl of soup, cream of roasted tomato, with a swirl of basil oil across the surface, then a plate of roasted beef, carved and arranged alongside mashed potatoes, and glazed carrots and green beans glistening with herbs, then a smaller plate of salad, a glass of water, a glass of apple juice, and eventually, because Dean had specifically requested it, a slice of chocolate torte with a small dish of whipped cream. When the food was placed in front of Amy, she didn't move. She sat and looked at the table laid out before her with an expression that Dean would later describe, to the very few people he trusted enough to tell this story, as the most heartbreaking thing he had ever seen in his life. Because it wasn't simple hunger in her face. It was something more complicated than that. It was the expression of someone who has wanted something so badly for so long that when it finally appears, some part of them cannot yet believe it's real. She seemed to be waiting for someone to come and take it away. "Go ahead," Dean said softly. "It's not going anywhere." She picked up the spoon. She dipped it into the soup, brought it to her lips, and closed her eyes for just a moment as she swallowed. Then she began to eat, slowly at first, with great deliberateness, as though she were being careful not to let herself understand how hungry she really was. Then faster, as her body overtook her caution and the reality of real food, warm food, food made with care and quality, registered in every nerve ending simultaneously. She ate the soup. She ate the bread. She started on the beef and the potatoes. Between bites, she kept apologizing in a low, rapid voice. "I'm sorry, I know this is strange. I'm so sorry for bothering you. You don't have to do this." And each time she apologized, Dean said the same thing. "Stop apologizing. Eat." He had set down his own fork and was watching her with that same quality of careful attention he'd had from the moment she approached his table. Something about this young woman had fixed his focus in a way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with something he couldn't yet articulate, a recognition without a name, a feeling like standing in a room you've never entered and knowing exactly where all the furniture is. The other diners in the Golden Room had gradually resumed their conversations, though at a lower volume and with occasional glances toward the corner table where Dean Martin was having dinner with a homeless woman in a worn-out coat. Some of them found it touching. Some of them found it uncomfortable. A few of them found it extraordinary. All of them found it impossible to entirely ignore. When Amy had eaten most of what was on the plates in front of her, she slowed. She picked up the napkin and pressed it briefly to her lips with a self-consciousness that suggested the gesture was not entirely natural to her anymore, that certain habits of former life required conscious effort to remember now. Then she set the napkin down and looked at Dean Martin across the candlelit table with those dark, tired, still somehow alive eyes, and something shifted between them. The silence became less awkward and more something else. More like the silence between two people who are about to have a conversation that matters. "Thank you," she said. Just that. 2 words, but carrying the weight of everything the evening had been. "You're welcome," he said. "Do you want to tell me how you ended up here tonight?" She hesitated. Then she did. Her name was Amy Carter. She had grown up in Los Angeles. For 3 years, she had worked at a children's daycare center in the Silver Lake neighborhood. Work she loved. Work she was apparently quite good at, because the children had adored her, and the parents had trusted her, and the director of the center had been grooming her for a full-time assistant teaching position, the first step toward the elementary school teaching career she'd been working toward. She talked about the children the way you talk about people who've changed you, with a specific, detailed tenderness. She remembered their names. She remembered the funny things they said, the pictures they drew her, the way they grabbed her hand on the walk to playground. Then she got sick. She wasn't entirely specific about what had happened to her health, and Dean didn't push. What she made clear was that it had been serious enough to require hospitalization, and expensive enough to produce a stack of medical bills that she spent months trying and failing to manage. She had insurance, but not enough insurance. She borrowed money. She applied for assistance programs. She tried to keep working while she recovered, but her body wouldn't cooperate. And eventually, between the illness and the debt and the sheer exhausting arithmetic of trying to stay solvent on a child care worker's salary in Los Angeles, things began to come apart. She lost her job first, then her apartment. 3 weeks of late notices, and then a conversation with her landlord that she described without bitterness, just with kind of flat, stating the facts tone that told Dean she had moved through the grief of that loss a long time ago. She had packed what she could carry. She had arranged to stay with a friend, then with 2 acquaintances, then with a woman from her old workplace who had a couch and a generous spirit. These arrangements had each lasted a few weeks before they ran their course. And then one morning she had been on the street with her canvas bag and nowhere to go. The final blow, she explained, was the theft of her purse. Everything critical was in it: her identification, her social security card, her bank card, though the account was nearly empty by then anyway. The folder of documents she'd been carefully maintaining. Medical records, letters of recommendation, copies of her teaching certifications. Gone. All of it. And without identification. She discovered you essentially cease to exist in any official capacity. You cannot apply for jobs. You cannot open a bank account. You cannot access most social services. You become a ghost moving through a city that has no mechanism for acknowledging you. When you lose your home, she said, looking down at the empty plate, people stop seeing your face. They see the fact that you're homeless, and that's all they see. It's like your whole life before that just stops existing. You become this one thing, and everything you were before doesn't count anymore. Dean was quiet for a moment. How long? He asked. 8 months, she said. 8 months on the street. He nodded slowly. He was still watching her face with that same focused stillness. And he found himself asking, with a casualness he did not entirely feel, where she was from originally, where she'd grown up. She told him she'd been raised at St. Matthew's Children's Home in Los Angeles, an orphanage. The staff there had told her, when she was old enough to be told such things, that her mother had given her up immediately after she was born. She had never known anything about her father. She had grown up with particular specific loneliness of a child who understands from an early age that they came into the world and someone immediately decided not to keep them. She said without self-pity, again, with that same factual steadiness that told you the feeling was old enough to have been integrated, to have become simply part of the architecture of who she was. Dean asked where she had been born. St. Joseph Medical Center. She said, Los Angeles. He kept his face very still. He asked, carefully, conversationally, the way you ask questions when you are terrified of the answer, if she knew her birthday. She looked at him with a slight puzzlement at the specificity of the question, and then she told him, October 17th. The room seemed to tilt very slightly. October 17th. The same date. The exact same date. The same hospital. The same city. The same age she would have been. Everything he was hearing matched a calendar in his head that he had never stopped keeping, a calendar built around a single day more than 2 decades earlier that had broken something inside him so completely he had never been entirely sure he'd put it back together correctly. He asked her one more question, almost inaudible. Do you have any identifying marks? Birthmarks? Anything like that? She blinked. That's a very strange question. I know, he said. I'm sorry. You don't have to answer it. She studied him for a moment with those dark, careful eyes. Then she reached up and pushed her hair behind her left ear. Behind her left ear. In the precise hollow where the ear meets the skull, there was a small birthmark. irregular in shape, brownish red, roughly the size of a thumbprint. The blood in Dean Martin's veins seemed to go completely cold and then completely hot in the space of a single heartbeat. He had seen that birthmark before, not on Amy Carter. He had never met Amy Carter before tonight. He had seen it in a photograph that sat in a box in the back of his closet in his Los Angeles home, a box he had never been able to bring himself to throw away and had never quite been able to bring himself to open regularly because the opening of it always cost him more than he had to spend on any given day. In that box, among other things, was a medical photograph, the kind that hospitals sometimes took in those years as a matter of record. A photograph of a newborn infant, his daughter, the daughter he had been told was dead. The mark in the photograph was in exactly the same place, the exact same shape. He kept his expression calm the way men keep expressions calm when they're operating on some extreme emotional edge, some precipice where any visible reaction might cause them to lose their footing entirely. He picked up his wine glass and he took a careful sip and he set it back down and he said nothing. He did not say, "I think I might be your father." He did not say, "22 years ago I was told you died." He did not say, "I have carried the grief of losing you for longer than you've been alive, and sitting across from you right now is the most disorienting experience of my entire existence." He said none of those things, because he was not certain, and the possibility of being wrong, of planting in this young woman's mind the seed of a hope that turned out to be false, of adding that particular cruelty to everything she had already endured, was something he was not willing to do, not without proof, not without absolute certainty. So instead, he made a decision. He signaled to one of his assistants, a young man named Thomas, who had worked with him for several years and whom Dean trusted with a specific and carefully earned kind of trust. He excused himself from the table briefly and spoke to Thomas in a low voice in the corridor beside the restaurant. Then he came back and sat down. After Amy finished the chocolate torte, she ate it with a careful, considered appreciation of someone who has not tasted anything sweet in a very long time. Dean told her that he had arranged a room for her at the hotel, a real room, with a proper bed and a private bathroom and everything she needed. He told her it was taken care of entirely. He told her that in the morning, someone would bring her clothes in her size, and that he had also arranged for a doctor to come and give her a full examination, just to make sure she was all right physically. Amy stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not suspiciously exactly, but genuinely uncertain. Because people did not do this. Strangers, even generous strangers, did not do this. There was something here she didn't understand, and she had learned to pay attention to things she didn't understand. Dean smiled at her. It was the real smile, not the stage one, quieter and more specific, less performed. "Because you needed help," he said, "and because I happen to be in a position to give it. That's enough reason." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "Thank you. I don't know what else to say." "You don't have to say anything else," he told her. "Just get some rest." He watched her leave with the hotel's guest services manager, who had received, in the previous 15 minutes, a very clear set of instructions from Dean Martin regarding how Amy Carter was to be treated during her stay. Instructions that included the phrase, "Exactly as you would treat any other guest in this hotel, or I will be having a different conversation with you tomorrow morning." And then he sat alone at his corner table in the Golden Room for a long time, not eating and not drinking, just sitting. Around him, the restaurant continued its evening. The pianist had resumed playing. The chandeliers threw their warm light. The other diners spoke to each other in the comfortable, self-absorbed murmur of people who returned to their own lives after a brief interruption. Waiters moved between tables. Glasses clinked. Everything appeared to have returned to normal. But Dean Martin was not inside that normal. He was somewhere else entirely, standing at the edge of a memory so old and so painful that most of the time he kept it behind glass, like an exhibit in a museum of his own interior. He was standing at the door of a hospital room in Los Angeles in 1956, in October, on the 17th day of that month, and a doctor was coming toward him down a white corridor with an expression that told him everything before the man even opened his mouth. His wife had gone into labor 6 weeks early. There had been complications. Serious ones. The kind that turn a hospital into a place of crisis and quiet urgency, where nurses moved faster and spoke less and doors were closed that had previously been open. He had spent hours in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, holding himself together with the specific effort of someone who has decided, in the absence of information, to simply refuse to imagine the worst. When the doctor finally came, he told Dean that his wife was alive. She was unconscious, exhausted, recovering. She would be all right. Then he said the other thing. The baby had not survived. A girl. They had been expecting a girl. But there had been a problem. He used medical terms that Dean did not entirely understand and retained even less. The important sentence, the one that lodged in his chest like something physical, was simple. The baby had not survived. Given the circumstances, given the state of his wife, given the trauma of the delivery, it had been felt by the hospital staff, acting in what they believed to be everyone's best interest, that the parents should not be shown the infant. A funeral had been arranged. A small white coffin. A plot in a cemetery in the hills east of Los Angeles. He had stood beside that coffin with his wife, who was pale and barely recovered, and holding his hand with both of hers, as though she might fall without the anchor of him. And he had buried a daughter he had never seen. For 22 years he had believed that story entirely. Now, alone at a table in Las Vegas with a glass of wine, he couldn't taste and the sound of the piano doing absolutely nothing to reach him. He was beginning to wonder if the story had been a lie. It was Thomas, his assistant, who made the call that night to the private investigator Dean kept on retainer, a man named Gerald Foss, discreet and thorough and available at any hour, which was exactly the quality you wanted in a private investigator when you were Dean Martin, and questions could emerge at any time. Dean had given Thomas a list of what he needed, and Thomas had transcribed it with a focused efficiency that made him valuable. Every available record connected the birth of Dean Martin's daughter at St. Joseph Medical Center on October 17, 1956. Hospital records, birth certificates. Any birth certificates filed at that hospital on that date that were later associated with adoption or transfer to a children's home. Records from St. Matthew's Children's Home in Los Angeles. The names of every doctor and nurse who had been on shift that night. Former hospital administrators. Anyone who might have any piece of the truth that had been kept from him, because that was the shape the night had taken now. Not simply the story of a famous man's generosity toward a homeless young woman, though it was also that. Not simply a remarkable coincidence of dates and places and physical characteristics, though it was certainly that. It had become something else, something larger and older and more consequential. It had become a question about a night in 1956 when something might have happened in a hospital corridor that nobody had ever told him about. A decision made without his knowledge or consent, in the name of protection or convenience or some calculation he couldn't yet understand. And about whether the young woman sleeping tonight in a warm hotel room for the first time in 8 months might be the answer to a question he had carried in his body for more than 2 decades. He went to his own suite very late that night. He opened a minibar and poured himself a small glass of bourbon, and then he sat at the desk without drinking it and he stared at the wall. After a while he got up and went to the phone and made a call to his home in Los Angeles, where, in a closet in the back of his bedroom, there was a box. He asked someone there to find it and to bring him, specifically, the medical photograph that was inside it. He described the box and described the photograph and gave very specific instructions about how to handle it. Then he hung up the phone and he sat back down. He thought about Amy Carter's face across the candlelit table, the shape of it, the line of her jaw, which was his jaw, which was a jaw he saw in photographs of his own younger self, in the mirror, in old film stills that journalists occasionally reproduced. The way she had laughed once, briefly, telling him something about one of the children she'd worked with at the daycare, a sudden flash of unguarded light in her face. And the way that laugh had sent something electric through him that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with recognition. The deepest kind of recognition. The kind that bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to something more fundamental. He thought about the birthmark. He thought about the hospital. He thought about October 17th. He opened the photo album he had brought with him on this trip. He always brought one, though he could not have explained why to anyone's satisfaction, and he turned the pages slowly in the low light of the desk lamp. Photographs of his children, Photographs of his career, his friends, his marriages, and there, near the back, tucked between 2 pages as though he had placed it there deliberately and then half forgotten it, a small black and white photograph of himself at the cemetery, standing beside a white coffin no larger than a bread box, his wife beside him, his face turned slightly away from the camera, the expression on his face visible even in profile, even in black and white, even across the distance of 22 years. He sat with that photograph for a long time, in the room down the hall, though Dean did not know exactly which room, only that it was somewhere in the same hotel, somewhere in the same building. Separated from him by corridors and carpets and elevator shafts, Amy Carter was sleeping. She had taken a shower for the first time in days. She had put on the complimentary robe hanging behind the bathroom door, and she had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room around her. The clean white sheets, the soft lamp, the small wrapped chocolates on the pillow that she had eaten immediately with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone not yet used to pretending indifference to small pleasures, and then she had lain down and pulled the covers to her chin and stared at the ceiling for a while. She was thinking about the man at the table, about the way he had stood up, about the words he had chosen, about the quality of attention he had paid her, not the attention of someone performing kindness for an audience, but something quieter and more genuine, the attention of someone who was actually trying to see her. She had not been seen in a very long time. She hadn't realized, until tonight, exactly how long. She was also thinking about his questions, the specific questions, the birthmark question especially. She couldn't account for it. It sat in her mind with an odd, unresolved weight, like a sentence with no ending, and then exhaustion overtook thought, as it will when the body has been pushed far enough, and Amy Carter slept. She slept longer and more deeply than she had slept in months. Meanwhile, in the suite down the hall, Dean Martin did not sleep at all. He sat at the desk in the low light, and he thought about what he knew and what he didn't know and what he was afraid to know and what he needed to know anyway. He thought about the 22 years he had carried this grief. Specific, named grief, the grief of a child given a name and a burial and a permanent place in the geography of loss. He thought about what it would mean if the grief had been built on something that wasn't true. He thought about what it would mean for Amy if it turned out he was right. He thought about how to handle the space between this moment and the moment when the truth, whatever it was, became available. Gerald Foss called at 2:15 in the morning. He had been doing what Dean's team had asked, making calls, accessing archives, locating contacts. He had already spoken to a former administrator from St. Joseph Medical Center who was now retired and living in Pasadena. He was already pulling records from St. Matthew's Children's Home through a legal contact who handled late-night requests for clients of considerable resources. He expected to have preliminary findings within 48 hours, possibly sooner. Whatever it costs, Dean told him. Whatever you need, I want the full picture. After he hung up, he poured the bourbon he had been ignoring for 2 hours, and he drank it slowly, and he thought about a question he had not let himself ask openly in 22 years, a question that had lived in him so quietly and so continuously that he had stopped recognizing it as a question, and had simply accepted it as a permanent condition of his interior life, like tinnitus or a bad knee. He had always believed, on some deep and wordless level, that the story he had been told was incomplete. He had never allowed himself to follow that feeling anywhere because the place it pointed toward was too painful. If his daughter had not died, if she had lived, then she had lived without him. She had grown up without a father. She had spent her childhood in an institution. She had struggled without any of the resources and protection that he could have provided. That thought, that possibility, was in some ways harder to bear than the grief of a death. A death was finished. This was a different kind of loss entirely. The night passed. The desert outside the hotel windows was dark and vast and indifferent. Dawn came eventually, as it always does, seeping across the Nevada sky in colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were given everything that was happening in a hotel suite on the 14th floor. Dean Martin sat and waited for the truth. And whatever the truth turned out to be, he already knew one thing. The thing he had known from the moment he'd stood up from his chair in the Golden Room and told a manager to let go of a young woman's arm. He already knew that Amy Carter's life was going to be different from this point forward, regardless of biology, regardless of what the records showed, regardless of whether the birthmark meant what he thought it meant, and the date meant what he thought it meant, and the hospital meant what he thought it meant. He had made a silent promise in that restaurant. In the space between the moment she'd whispered her request and the moment he'd answered it. Not because he suspected anything then. He hadn't yet, not consciously, but because something in him had recognized something in her, and the recognition had felt like an obligation, and Dean Martin had never been the kind of man who walked away from those. The investigation that Gerald Foss conducted over the following days was meticulous and thorough and deeply, disturbingly productive. Records that had been filed and forgotten for 2 decades proved to be not quite as buried as someone had apparently intended. A nurse who had been present on the ward that night in 1956 was located in a retirement community in Tucson. A former hospital administrator had, in the intervening years, developed a conscience that had not been particularly active in 1956. Adoption records from St. Matthew's Children's Home, cross-referenced with intake dates and ages and originating institutions, told a story that was increasingly, overwhelmingly, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. A baby girl born at St. Joseph Medical Center on October 17, 1956, a baby whose records indicated she was the daughter of a couple who believed she had died, had been transferred to St. Matthew's Children's Home in Los Angeles 48 hours after her birth. The transfer had been arranged by a hospital administrator who, according to the nurse's account, had received a request, the exact nature which remained unclear, but which the nurse described as coming from someone of significant influence, to handle the situation discreetly. The reasons given, the nurse recalled, had something to do with protecting the mother from additional trauma. The baby had been healthy. The baby had never been in any danger. The baby had a small, irregularly shaped birthmark behind her left ear. She had been given the name Amy at the home. Amy Carter. Carter was a surname the orphanage assigned to unidentified children that year. She had grown up believing she was unwanted. She had spent her entire life not knowing that her father had stood beside a white coffin in a cemetery in the hills east of Los Angeles and wept for her. When Dean read the investigator's full report, sitting alone in his suite with the door locked and the curtains drawn and the bourbon left untouched on the desk beside him, he did not perform any visible reaction. He read the document twice. Then he set it down on the desk very carefully. With both hands, the way you set down something that might shatter. He sat quietly for a long time. When he finally stood up, he did not wipe his eyes or adjust his expression or do any of the things a person does when they're trying to reassemble themselves after something has rearranged them at a fundamental level. He simply stood up, walked to the phone, and asked the front desk to please send a message to the guest in room 1422 that Mr. Martin was wondering if she would join him for breakfast. Amy came. She was wearing the clothes that had been provided for her the previous morning. Simple but clean, the first new clothes she had worn in months, and she had clearly slept well because the desperate exhaustion in her face had receded slightly, replaced by something more alert, more present. She sat down across from him at the breakfast table by the window of his suite, where the Nevada morning was spread out golden and enormous beyond the glass, and she accepted the coffee that was poured for her, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that he now knew were his eyes, genetically speaking, the eyes that appeared in his own old photographs and in the faces of people he was related to, and she waited. He took a breath, and then Dean Martin told Amy Carter the truth. All of it. The pregnancy, the complications, the doctor in the corridor, the white coffin, the 22 years of believing, the dinner 2 nights ago and the things she had said, and the date and the hospital and the birthmark. He told her about Gerald Foss and the investigation, and the nurse in Tucson, and the records that had been found in the files of St. Matthew's Children's Home. He put the investigator's report on the table between them. He put the medical photograph of the birthmark beside it. He put a photograph of himself from 1956, a young man, 39 years old, with a jaw she would recognize from mirrors. Beside that, he told her everything, and he waited. Amy Carter sat across from him with her coffee going cold in her hands and did not say anything for a very long time. She looked at the documents. She looked at the photographs. She looked at him. She looked back at the documents. She was breathing carefully and deliberately in the way people breathe when they are managing something enormous, something that is too large to move through quickly and must instead be approached slowly, from different angles, allowed to become real in stages rather than all at once. Finally, she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, "You're saying someone decided to take me away from you, that I didn't have to grow up the way I did." "Yes," he said, "that's what I'm saying." She looked out the window at the Nevada morning for a long time. "And you didn't know," she said. "You thought I was dead." "Yes." Another long silence. Then she turned back from the window and looked at him directly, and her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with crying, though she was also, he realized, very much crying. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why didn't you just, after you found out, why tell me?" It was a real question. A good one. He considered it. "Because you've lived your whole life without knowing who you were," he said. "And you've been treated your whole life as though you were less than what you are. And I thought that you deserved to know the truth, even if the truth is painful, even if nothing can go back. You deserve to know." She nodded very slowly, processing. Then, after another silence that felt somehow like the most important silence in the room, she said very quietly, "I used to wonder sometimes, when I was little at the home, why nobody came. You know, children do that. You wonder what was wrong with you, why nobody wanted you." She paused. "It turns out somebody did want me." The words landed in the room like something irreversible. "Yes," Dean said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Yes, somebody did." What came next was not a dramatic scene. Life rarely is when the truly important things happen. It was a breakfast table in a hotel suite in Las Vegas, with coffee going cold and the morning light falling to the window, and two people sitting across from each other with an entire lost history between them, beginning, tentatively, imperfectly, with full awareness of everything that could not be recovered. To figure out what came next, there would be more conversations. There would be lawyers and DNA tests, because this was the real world, and not a film and documentation mattered. There would be complex feelings on both sides, grief for what had been lost, anger at what had been done, uncertain about what to make of a relationship that had no ordinary template, that had skipped 22 years and was now trying to find its footing somewhere in the middle. There would be people who were skeptical and people who had opinions, and the particular circus that attends anything in the life of a famous person when it becomes public. But all of that was later. All of that was the next chapter. This chapter, this moment, was a man and a woman sitting across a breakfast table in the morning light, and the man was saying, "I want to help you get back on your feet. Whatever you need. School, work, a place to live. We'll figure out together. If you want that." And the woman. This young woman who had walked into a restaurant the night before last with nothing but a canvas bag and 72 hours of hunger and the specific kind of courage that only persists in people who lost almost everything and kept going anyway, looked at him with an expression that had no single name in the English language, that was part grief and part disbelief and part something tentative and fragile that had not been present in her face since she was very small. "I want that," she said. That was how it started. Not with fanfare, not with a Hollywood moment, not with music swelling beneath it, with two people sitting in the morning light and breakfast going cold on the table between them, and a story beginning again from a place where everyone had believed it had ended. Amy Carter enrolled in a teaching program that spring at a college in Los Angeles, with her tuition covered and a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and for the first time in her adult life, something that felt like the ground being solid beneath her feet. She was an extraordinary student. Her professors remember her later as someone who paid attention in a particular way, as though she understood, from personal experience, the precise value of being seen and taken seriously by someone in a position of authority. She graduated. She taught. She was, by every account that exists, remarkable at it. And somewhere in Los Angeles, in a box in the back of a closet, there was a medical photograph that no longer meant what it had meant for 22 years. It no longer meant an ending. It meant, instead, a beginning that had been delayed by someone's cowardice or convenience or calculation, but not prevented, never entirely prevented. Because on an October night in Las Vegas, a hungry young woman had gathered every remaining piece of her courage, walked through a door she had no right to walk through, and asked a famous stranger if she could eat what he didn't finish. And the stranger had stood up. He had said 2 words. He had pulled out a chair. And everything that had seemed finished, everything that had been buried and grieved and accepted as irrevocably gone, All of it had turned out to be only waiting. Waiting in the space between one life and another. Between a question and its answer. Between the courage it takes to ask for the smallest thing. And the grace it takes to give more than you were asked for. Some stories don't end when you think they do. Some of the most important ones are only just beginning at what looked like the very last possible moment. This was one of those stories. And it started with a question, so small, it was barely a whisper.